Spectrovision Radio.
For early access to ad-free episodes, visit patreon.com/WNMTK podcast. If you don't believe there's such thing as a curse, that's because you've never met anyone afflicted by one. It's an idea the world doesn't ever truly prime you for, one that seems to exist outside of the structure and rules we need to live by in order for the world around us to stay predictable and feel safe. But I can tell you that curses aren't just unfortunate events masquerading as coincidence. They are physical beings. They choose prey, they stalk, and they devour slowly. I've thought long and hard about what the first beat in this story is, a story that's come to define and consume my entire life. And after all my inner searching, all the solo expeditions I've launched into the deepest recesses of my memory, I still think the very first instance, the first indication that my life was not like most people's, was that night my sister Robin spoke to it. Robin is 2 years younger than me, and we shared a room for most of our childhood. On the night that I think marks the beginning of this saga being set in motion, when the ceaseless march towards its inevitable end was called into action by forces I didn't yet understand, we were about 6 and 8 years old, respectively. I was laying in bed on the cusp of falling asleep when I heard Robin whispering. I turned over to look toward her bed, and in the warm amber glow emitting from our nightlight, I could see that she was laying flat on her back, but with her head tilted to one side so she was facing away from me, facing the wall, and she was talking to something I couldn't see. I watched, unable to make out any of the words, as she carried on a hushed conversation with an invisible partner. "Robin, what are you doing?" I asked. She stopped and lay there silent for a moment. "I'm talking to someone," she said, still facing the wall. "Who?" I asked. "His name is Alfie Tarim," she replied. It seems even stranger to me now, but even then the specificity and unusualness of the name struck me. Where had she got such a thing from? It seemed too oddly precise for her to have concocted it in her 6-year-old brain, but too weird to be any kind of real moniker she could have come across in the real world. "Don't worry," she said. "I've spoken to him before." I sat there, keeping silent in the low light, continuing to just watch her as she kept talking to me while still facing the wall. "He scratches at the window sometimes," Robin said softly. "He tells me everything's going to be okay." Her words unnerved me. She delivered them with none of the whimsy children do when talking about imaginary friends. Instead, they were loaded with the galvanized certitude one only gets when talking about someone very much real. "Knock it off and go to sleep," I said sternly, wanting my voice to be commanding and trying to pull seniority. "You're keeping me awake." With that, I turned away from her again and closed my eyes. I lay there for a while, hoping she hadn't realized how rattled I was. But eventually I started to feel the encroaching creep of slumber drape its comforting blanket over me. Suddenly, it was pulled back, and I heard Robin whisper once more. "Oh, that's my brother." The incident with Robin, when she spoke to that disembodied presence in the night, didn't happen again, but that was entirely due to me not letting it. Robin mentioned Alfie Tarim a few times after that, but I shut her down so hard each time, with harsh words, or sometimes even physically pushing her, the way kids do when they don't know how else to impose their will on the world around them. So she soon stopped speaking his name. I told myself it really must have been an imaginary friend she was just taking too seriously as a concept, and steadily forgot about it. It wasn't until around 3 years later that the next beat in this story unfolded. On my 11th birthday, to be precise. Our house was filled with friends and relatives, spilling out from the cramped space and into the backyard, where my Uncle George spearheaded games for us to play, while the other adults sipped beers and watched. I was always excited to see Uncle George whenever he visited. He'd never been married, and I had only the vaguest memory of meeting a woman named Donna he'd been in a relationship with at some point. He didn't have any kids of his own, and seemed to relish the role of fun uncle, really putting in the effort to show us a good time and being far more lenient than my parents ever would be, letting us stay up late, letting us eat whatever we wanted, as long as we kept it between us, of course. But there was another side to Uncle George, one you only caught glimpses of in small moments when he wasn't engaged in playing that jubilant role. He seemed to be holding on to a certain kind of sadness I couldn't put my finger on. Like a chameleon, the slightest shade off its surroundings, George gave the impression of someone doing a good job of hiding that he was haunted. By what? I didn't know. But even as a child, there were telltale moments. A smile that looked a little too pained to convincingly paper over the cracks. A heavy sigh and a lamenting frown whenever he didn't know I was watching him. A certain loneliness whenever he'd fall quiet in a room full of people, laughter, and light, like he somehow existed away from it, somehow alone. That day, after the party had drawn to a close, I'd gone to bed with Uncle George still helping my parents to clear everything up after the frenzy of dozens of kids, turning the place into absolute chaos. Full of cake and soda, but worn out from a full day of overstimulation and running around, I quickly fell asleep. But all that soda caught up with me, and I woke up in the middle of the night desperately needing to pee. I got up and used the bathroom, but as I was coming back out, I heard something strange coming from the living room. Noises that sounded like someone groaning. I snuck over to the door and peeked inside. My Uncle George was in there, alone, and I could see by the pillow and blanket on the couch that he was staying the night. But he wasn't on the couch. Instead, he was on the floor, squirming around and moaning in what sounded like pain. I stared at him, seeing there was a nasty cut above his eyebrow, and I could see the glass coffee table had been partially smashed. It was as if he'd been assaulted, beaten up. I stood there, frozen in fear, listening to him softly cry out. What was it that had done this to him? His eyes flickered open and he peered up at me, barely able to lift his head off the carpet. He tried to smile, but managed barely a flicker before his lips drew back into a grimace. Gingerly, he raised a shaking hand and beckoned me over. I hesitated, but approached, realizing even at my young age that he needed help. I drew in close. He locked eyes with me best he could, and spoke. "Be careful," he said in a dry rasp, "or the family tree will get you." His head lolled back as if he had no strength to keep it up with. His eyes closed once more, and he fell into an uneasy, convulsive sleep. I was about to call out for help, but just as the cry was loading up in my lungs, I felt hands on my shoulders. I turned to see my dad, who rushed me out of the room and back to bed. But it was too late. I'd already seen, and heard, enough for me to make sense now of what was to come later, enough for me to connect the dots, and how they all linked back to Alfie Terram. My parents had dealt with the situation by telling me that Uncle George was sick, and we barely saw him anymore after that, with my parents claiming he was busy whenever I asked to visit him. But even then, I didn't buy it. Sick? That didn't make sense. I knew something had done that to him. I just didn't know what. But life ticked on, and my young mind found ways to distract itself from the mystery of what had transpired that night. Little did I know, I was still really at the beginning of this whole story, and the next beat came around in a way I never could have anticipated. My parents' room had a small walk-in closet that, due to limited space in the house, had steadily become a dumping ground for things we probably should have tossed out, but kept on the off chance we'd still want them. Old pairs of rollerblades, a broken freestanding heater my dad insisted he could fix, suitcases of all sizes for trips we never took. You name it. But one day, my mom decided enough was enough and cleared it out. Immediately after she'd got rid of it all, the closet was completely empty. Something me and a couple of friends who came around to play after school one day decided would be the perfect setting for an experiment. There were no windows in that closet, and if you closed the door and someone turned off the light from outside, it was pitch black. Our idea was to see who could stay in there the longest without getting scared. Foster, the self-proclaimed bravest of the three of us, went first. We closed him inside, turned off the light, and made ghost sounds and banged on the walls, hoping to scare him. He emerged soon after, claiming that he'd just gotten bored and that he could have stayed inside as long as he wanted, but daring us to beat his time. Dustin went next, the most eager to please of the bunch, and we tried a different approach. Foster and I signaled to one another that we should stay completely silent. It didn't take long for Dustin to start calling out to us, but we didn't reply, and his cries started to betray a hint of desperation. Soon after, he burst out of the closet, face painted with a pretend smile and offering transparent claims that he hadn't really been that scared. Then it was my turn. I walked into the closet, and they closed the door before hitting the light switch and plunging me into total darkness. After the success of how we'd managed to creep Dustin out, I wasn't surprised that they also gave me the silent treatment. For a while, I don't know how long, I was fine, patiently waiting it out and wanting to be the one who lasted the longest. But then, something changed. It was the smell that hit me first. A smell like wet dirt, like how soil smells after rain. But it wasn't until I heard the creaking that I felt genuinely unnerved. From behind me, I heard sounds like groaning wood, how I imagine an old wooden ship to sound when it's shifting on the sea. I span around on the spot and was terrified to see that two gleaming green eyes were looming above me, impossibly emitting enough light for me to see the being they belonged to. I span back around again to get out of there, but the door wouldn't open, and I realized to my abject fear that Foster and Dustin were holding it shut. "Let me out! Let me out!" I screamed. I pounded the door with my fists, yelling for them to release me, as those groaning calls of creaking wood continued to sound behind me. Eventually, the door burst open, and I saw my dad standing there. I rushed out of the closet and ran to the living room where I stood stunned and not knowing what to do. My dad came in, along with Foster and Dustin, and said something about us needing to play nice, before declaring that we could play video games for half an hour if we promised not to cause any more trouble. Foster and Dustin completely forgot about our experiment immediately upon hearing those tantalizing words, and rushed to park themselves in front of the TV and grab the controllers. But I couldn't move on that quickly. Unlike them, I really had seen something in that dark solitude of the closet. Because when I'd turn around to face whatever it was that was emitting those strange sounds, I'd seen something, or someone, that I didn't understand. It was 7 foot tall, with uneven, bark-like skin covering its long, almost cylindrical body. On either side of it were thick arms, which gave way to what must have been hands, which brandished dozens and dozens of thin, finger-like branches. And its head, consisting only of those impossibly green eyes, atop which sat a crown of thorns, pointing straight up into the air. My chest heaved up and down. I felt adrenaline surging through me, rising until I felt I was going to burst. I looked at Foster and Dustin, who were sitting on the floor, gazes glued to the TV. I knew that Foster would have been the ringleader in trapping me in there with that thing, and there he was, happily playing video games after subjecting me to that nightmare. I marched over to him, grabbed him by the shirt, and punched him in the face so hard that I knocked out one of his teeth. I struggled through high school. Drugs, alcohol, and fighting became a part of my life. My parents took me to see a couple of therapists, but I didn't tell any of them the real reason for my behavior. The truth was, my existence had become a continuum of dread, a constant waiting game for each time that thing I'd seen in the closet would show up again, and what would happen when it did. What new mistake it had caused me to make, what new way it had caused me to act out, as I struggled to deal with the uncontrollable emotions its terror instilled in me. But by the day the SAT rolled around, it had been a while since that thing had paid me a visit, and I'd been able to keep myself fairly straight and out of trouble as a result. I thought that just maybe its reign of terror might have ended, or that at least it had slowed. Even the idea that I'd get just a little more time between each ladder and the inevitable next shoot in the crazy game my life had become seemed like absolute bliss. So going into the SAT, I was beginning to allow myself to feel something like hope. I'd studied hard, my GPA was leveling out, and I wanted the end of school to act as some kind of springboard into adulthood. That nebulous concept of being a grown-up, which we're told will give us all the answers, and where the panic of being a child and not understanding the world would evaporate and become a distant memory. But fate, or the curse that had dictated mine, had other plans. That morning, when I went to my locker, I opened it to find those overwhelming green eyes staring back at me. I shot backwards, slipping and falling to the floor as I watched it climb out of that space, perverting its giant body into impossible shapes in order to fit through the locker, until it was standing in the hallway, looming over me. I looked around, needing someone to help me, but all the other students were just staring at me, looking at me like I'd lost my mind, and I realized they couldn't see it like I could. I scrambled to my feet and fled, running to the score of jeers and taunts from the less kind pupils who'd already decided I was crazy and were enjoying acting as town criers to the fact. I burst through the main doors and kept running until I was all the way down the street, where I doubled over, a pain punishingly stabbing at my side. Staring back in the direction of the school, I knew I couldn't go back there. Knew I couldn't take the SAT. But what I did know was that I had to find a way to stop from feeling the way I was feeling, whatever the cost. So instead of running back into the school and course-correcting my future, I made my way into town, met up with a guy I'd scored from in the past, and got so high behind the dumpsters in an alleyway that serviced the back entrances to a set of stores that I passed out on the concrete and didn't wake up again until after nightfall, when a uniformed employee jabbed me in the ribs and told me he'd call the cops if I didn't split. After flunking out of high school, I stuck around with the others who'd made a mess of things, and quickly fell into a bad crowd wasting away their lives getting high and doing next to nothing else. It's hard to plan ahead or make something of yourself when you're stuck in a cycle of self-sabotage and trying to pick up the pieces. A cycle dictated by a clock that doesn't follow the predictable laws of time you've been told govern the universe, and you never know when it's going to decide to chime. So mine became a life of small chunks. Jobs, friendships, romances, they were always short-lived, and I became so jaded with the fact I'd inevitably blow them up at some point that I began to treat them as expendable, took them for granted, never committed or invested true emotion. Because whenever that clock did chime, and he came to visit, whenever I had to endure even a second in his horrifying, intolerable presence, I knew I'd do something to cause pain, problems, and misery to both myself and those around me, and that to cope with it, I'd seek escape in bottles and plastic baggies. Unlike me, my sister Robin had aced high school and had gone away to a prestigious college, while I stood still and slowly rotted. She'd graduated and had immediately found herself a well-paid job in a big city, and by the time the next significant event in this story happened, she was getting married to a guy she'd met her first week of college, and had been head over heels for ever since. I didn't get to talk to her until after the ceremony on her wedding day, but once I did, she embraced me, radiant and beautiful in her dress. It had been a while since we'd seen one another, but if she was troubled by my gaunt, pallid appearance, she didn't let it show. Her expression set into what looked like a genuine smile. "Where's your +1?" she asked, referencing the conspicuously vacant space beside me that had followed me around all day like a shadow. I was looking forward to meeting... She searched for a name I'd never given her, and of course came up short. "We've gone our separate ways," I said, not wanting to get into it. "Sorry I didn't let you know, but it only just happened." She shrugged it off and we chatted about this and that, and nothing at all, until she was swept away by the next set of people who wanted to congratulate her. Before I could move away, I felt a hand on my shoulder and turned to see my dad. Unlike Robin, his face did betray his true feelings. When his eyes took in his daughter, and the room filled with people celebrating her love and life, he beamed with pride. But when he switched his gaze to me, I saw only disappointment in his eyes. "I wanted all this for you too, son," he said. His words got under my skin, and I felt myself about to snap. But not wanting to cause a scene, I forced myself to look away from him. But when my stare hit the stage, on the other side of the room, the one where a microphone for speeches stood, and instruments set up for the band who would soon be playing, I froze. Positioned in the center of that stage was him, that giant, towering figure who stalked me unrelentingly. He stood out in the open, surveying his kingdom with those disturbingly green eyes, like a god only I could see, a god who had, for reasons I didn't understand, decided that I was the one who needed to be forsaken. I brushed my dad aside and tore out of the room, crashing out into the parking lot, wanting to get away from that place before I caused trouble on a day that wasn't mine to cause trouble on. My head span and my chest heaved, gasping for air, but I commanded myself to trudge forward, to put distance between the wedding and what I knew would soon become the radius of my toxic influence. As I struggled through the parking lot, I spotted a car I thought I recognized, but one that took me by surprise. It looked like Uncle George's car, but the same car he'd had when I was a kid, only now dilapidated and clinging on for dear life, testing the limits of being legal to drive to the extreme. I'd caught sight of Uncle George during the wedding ceremony, noting how he looked like he'd aged an entire lifetime since I'd last seen him, but I'd still been filled with as much excitement as I was capable of at the idea of catching up with him. Yet after the ceremony, he'd seemingly disappeared. I approached the car, and as I did, I saw that one of the back doors was open. Looking inside, I saw that Uncle George was in there, passed out across the back seats. I could tell from the smell and the dark patch on his pants that he'd wet himself, and his hand was still loosely gripping an almost entirely empty bottle of bourbon. I felt a pang of extreme sorrow in that moment, but it was fleeting, quickly replaced by something else, a clicking into place. Be careful, or the family tree will get you. In that moment, I realized why Uncle George had always seemed haunted, and what it was he'd really been warning me about. It was because that thing had chosen him, just like it had chosen me, that he too was coping with it the only way he could, by anesthetizing himself to its remorseless campaign of terror. The sound of wood groaning snapped me out of it. I looked back towards the venue and saw that hideous being had followed me out into the parking lot and was now lumbering forward in my direction. I tried to wake up Uncle George, but he was too far gone. Searching for a way out, I saw the keys were in the ignition, and I made the split-second decision to get behind the wheel. I put the car in drive and sped out of the parking lot as fast as I could and out into the road. Staring into the rearview mirror, I could see that thing still there, still plotting after us, still wanting whatever it was that plaguing us with its abject torment gave it. And that's the last thing I remember before everything went black. Miraculously, Uncle George escaped the car accident mostly unharmed. I, on the other hand, was treated to a double compound fracture to my right leg. It required 2 surgeries to put in 2 long titanium plates to pin it in place, and 28 screws to keep the whole thing together. But the pain of the injury, or the medical bills I racked up with no way of paying, were nothing compared to what came with it. Immobilized, first in my hospital bed, and then in my shitty apartment once they deemed I was well enough to go home, I became a sitting duck for that thing, which I now knew to be the family tree Uncle George had told me to watch out for all those years before. And it had a new approach, a new weapon in its arsenal of endless intimidation. It would quite literally take root in the corner of the room and just watch me as I lay there, unable to flee from it. That hulking presence, with those petrifying green eyes, promising only pain. I found that the only way for me not to see it was to obliterate myself, to flood my body with as many painkillers as I could. So that's what I did. I flowed through days in a zombified haze, rising only to answer the door whenever my dealer knocked with my latest delivery. By the time I was able to walk again, albeit delicately, a brief moment of clarity saw me break that cycle, and I found myself heading out to see Uncle George. We hadn't seen each other since I'd left the hospital. He tried calling, had left messages, but I'd been too busy, perfecting the art of being dead to the world, to respond. But despite the oblivion I was trying to make my new reality, a gnawing sense of guilt meant I found myself taking a bus all the way out to his home. I hadn't given him any warning of my arrival, and he seemed both pleasantly surprised but also embarrassed that I'd shown up unannounced. When we made our way into his living room, I realized why. The place clearly hadn't been cleaned in a long time, and was littered with a few empty fast food bags. But the real standout contributor to the detritus was all the empty booze bottles. Uncle George half-heartedly dusted the seat of an armchair and motioned for me to sit, casting a pained smile my way, one I'd seen on him many times before, but one that now took on new resonance as he dropped onto the couch. We spoke for a while about how we'd each been, mainly resorting to empty check-ins about my injuries and platitudes about how it was good I was on the mend. But once we dredged that shallow well until it was bone dry, I decided to talk about what I was really there for. "Uncle George, are you like this because of the family tree?" I asked, addressing the elephant in the room that had taken the form of all the booze. He stared back at me. Surprise gave way to something like recognition in his expression, and he gently nodded. We sat, not speaking for a moment, and I could feel him taking me in with more intent than he had up until that point. "Please don't tell me it's chosen you too," he asked, his voice crackling with genuine concern. I didn't answer, and he took my silence as a confirmation. I watched as his eyes, made bigger by the lenses of his thick glasses, welled up and reddened. "It's not fair," he said, his voice fully breaking now. "It skipped your dad and picked me. I thought if I didn't have kids it would..." He trailed off, stared briefly out of the window before reverting his gaze back to me. "I never thought it would come for you," he said, sounding so defeated, so broken. He began to cry and buried his face in his hands, and I felt tears crash onto my cheeks too. I got up and moved over to him and made him look at me, took his hand in mine. "I'll find a way to stop it," I said. He stared up at me with a pained look of frightened confusion, like he had no idea what I was talking about, like I was saying something so impossible that I might as well have said it in a language he didn't speak. "What do you mean?" he asked, rubbing at his eyes with his free hand. "How could you possibly do that?" "I have an idea," I said. "Something clicked that day I found you in the car, just before the accident. And I think I know someone who can help." I skulked around the neighborhood until I saw her husband climb into his car and drive away. I needed to be alone with her, needed her to listen. Robin barely got the door open a few inches when I barged in and made my way into her living room. She was taken aback by my presence, that I'd unexpectedly materialized out of nowhere, but she did her best to keep up appearances, and we sat opposite each other in her large, spotlessly clean, expensive home. "When we were kids, you used to speak to a man that wasn't there," I said, cutting straight to it. "You said his name was Alfie Taram." Robin stared back at me, her face scrunching up into a constellation of confusion. We sat there in silence until she realized I needed her to respond. "I vaguely remember having an imaginary friend," she said, spluttering her way through the words. "But I don't remember that name." "Don't play dumb with me, Robin," I said, making it clear I was in no mood to mess around. The constellation that formed her expression shifted, now morphing into one of deep concern. "You told me he used to scratch at the window and tell you everything would be okay," I said, now knowing she'd been referencing his twig-like fingers scraping at the glass. "He told you that because he knew you'd be fine, because he'd chosen me to torment instead." Robin went to speak, but I got there first, raising my voice a little so she'd know to keep quiet until I was done. "Did you make a deal with it?" I asked. "What did you offer to make it choose me instead of you?" "Marcus, you're not well," she said. "You need help." I ignored her feigned alarm at the state of my well-being. There was nothing she could say to keep my freight train of truth from steaming ahead. "The way I see it," I added, wanting her to know I understood how it worked, "is that it needs one victim per generation. It chose Uncle George over Dad, and it chose me over you. So speak to it," I demanded. "Tell it you will take the curse, even if it's just for a while. And tell it to put it on Dad instead of Uncle George. He's suffered enough. Please, Robin, I am begging you." But she just sat there, saying nothing. "You need to take it," I hissed, incensed by her silence and feeling desperation fizz through every nerve in my body. "You need to share the burden. I've been living with this all my life. It's not fair. I need to know what it's like to exist without its weight constantly bearing down on me." With our eyes locked, time seemed to slow, but I was happy to wait, because I needed her to validate what I was saying. Needed to have it confirmed that I'd cracked the curse's code, that I'd finally been able to peek behind the curtain of the bizarre, unjust rules that afflicted our bloodline. Finally, Robin nodded, and I felt as if I'd suddenly been unshackled from a boulder, one I hadn't realized I'd been carrying around my whole life. "Okay," she said solemnly, "but Teddy will be home soon, and we have a lot of ground to cover. Let me call him and get him to run some errands. Buy us some time." I nodded, feeling so light I could have floated away. "Thank you, Robin," I said. "Thank you." She got up and moved into the kitchen to make the call, and I found myself alone in her living room. My new weightlessness meaning I was able to actually take in my surroundings, instead of being tunnel-visioned by the burden of my purpose for being there. But the satisfaction of Robin's validation was fleeting. I saw something that gave me pause, something decorative on the wall. I got up and moved over to inspect it, to understand what exactly I was looking at. And when I did, I heard the lock on that shackle, the one connected to that boulder that had weighed me down for so long, snap back around my wrist. On Robin's wall was a piece of a tree disc, the kind where you've cut and preserved a slice of it so you can see the rings that tell you how old it is. And there it was, with pride of place in the center of her opulent living room, like a totem to the secret god that had given her that perfect life and condemned me to a living nightmare. As I clambered my way to the kitchen to confront her, I could hear Robin's voice as she spoke into the phone. "Please, send someone now. He's unstable and—" She turned to look at me, phone still at her ear, hand trembling, and I realized I'd got there too late. The police would soon be on their way, and there would be no convincing them of what I knew to be the truth, and that Robin would never sacrifice what her disgusting god had given her. I backed out of the kitchen, back into the living room, and I realized there was now something else in there too. Alfie Terim was there with me, the family tree, and I realized there was no escape, no way to move out from under the shadow of his colossal frame, no way to extricate myself from his tentacle-like branches, and the way they played puppeteer to my existence. So instead of running, I fell to my knees before it, that twisted, omniscient god, and opened my arms, welcoming its embrace of sheer lunacy and horror. "Do with me what you will," I screamed. "Do with me what you will."